What if the thing you're calling peace is actually emotional disappearance in progress? And what if the person you assume will always stay is already reacting to the silence you think is harmless? Because silence in love doesn't freeze the relationship. It rewrites it, often in ways you never expected. Have you ever stopped talking not to end the relationship, but just to protect your peace, only to notice the other person suddenly changing, pulling away, becoming distant, acting unpredictable, or doing something that feels completely out of character? That moment often confuses people. I didn't even do anything. So why are they reacting like this? But emotional systems don't respond to what is said. They respond to what is felt, and silence is still communication. Silence in relationships is never neutral because human beings are wired to interpret absence as information. When someone stops speaking, especially in an emotionally significant bond, the mind does not register it as nothing is happening. It immediately tries to assign meaning. This is a survival-based cognitive habit. In early human environments, sudden withdrawal or lack of response could signal danger, exclusion, or loss of connection from the group. That same wiring still operates today in modern relationships, even though the context is emotional rather than physical survival. When you go silent, the other person does not just experience the absence of words, they experience the absence of predictability. Predictability is what creates emotional safety. Without it, the brain starts scanning for causes. It may revisit recent conversations, tone changes, or minor disagreements, trying to locate the reason for the silence. This is where misinterpretation begins, because in the absence of clear communication, the mind defaults to assumptions shaped by past experiences, insecurities, and attachment patterns. For someone with a more anxious emotional style, silence can quickly feel like rejection or abandonment, even if that was never the intention. For someone more avoidant, it may feel like confirmation to withdraw further, creating emotional distance in response. Either way, silence becomes an active force shaping behavior, not a passive pause. What was meant as space, regulation, or protection can be interpreted as punishment, disinterest, or emotional detachment. This is why silence often escalates emotional tension rather than resolving it. The other person may begin to overthink, seek reassurance in indirect ways, or even create conflict just to break the uncertainty. The shocking part is not the silence itself, but the reactions it triggers that feel disproportionate or unexpected to the person who initiated it. In close emotional bonds, communication is not just about content, it is about continuity. When continuity breaks, the mind fills the gap immediately, and it rarely fills it with calm certainty. Emotional withdrawal often carries a weight that is far greater than the intention behind it. When someone pulls back emotionally, stops responding warmly, reduces communication, or becomes distant, it is rarely experienced by the other person as a neutral act. Instead, it is interpreted through an emotional lens that looks for meaning, especially in close relationships where attachment has already formed. The absence of emotional presence does not feel like space to most people. It feels like a shift in connection, and the mind immediately tries to define that shift. One of the most common interpretations of withdrawal is rejection. Even if no rejection was intended, the nervous system is highly sensitive to changes in relational energy. Warmth turning into coldness, responsiveness turning into silence, or engagement turning into avoidance can trigger internal alarm systems. The brain begins to ask, what changed? And, was it something I did? This is not a conscious choice. It is an automatic pattern rooted in the need to maintain connection and avoid exclusion. Another interpretation is punishment. When emotional withdrawal follows conflict or discomfort, the other person may not see it as self-regulation. Instead, it can feel like a deliberate withholding of care or attention. This is especially true in relationships where communication about boundaries and emotional needs is weak or inconsistent. In such cases, silence or withdrawal becomes loaded with meaning, even if it was only meant as a coping mechanism. Disinterest is another assumption that quickly forms. If someone who was previously engaged suddenly becomes distant, the mind often jumps to the conclusion that feelings have changed. This can create insecurity and lead to behaviors aimed at restoring the connection, such as over-explaining, seeking reassurance, or increasing emotional intensity. The complexity is that emotional withdrawal is often used as a form of self-protection, not rejection. People withdraw to regulate overwhelm, avoid conflict, or process emotions internally. However, without verbal clarity, the impact on the other person is shaped entirely by perception, not intention. And perception in emotionally charged situations is rarely neutral. It is filtered through past experiences, fears of loss, and attachment sensitivities, which is why withdrawal so often creates misunderstanding rather than resolution. People rarely respond to the literal absence of facts. They respond to the mental vacuum that absence creates. When there is no clear explanation for someone's behavior, the brain does not stay comfortable with, "I don't know." It actively tries to resolve uncertainty because uncertainty is experienced as psychological tension. This is why people often construct entire narratives around silence, even when no new information has been given. The mind prefers a story, any story, over an unresolved gap. In close relationships, assumptions tend to form very quickly because emotional investment is high. The more someone matters, the more the brain scans for cues about their intentions. When communication is missing, that scanning process becomes intensified. Small details from the past get reinterpreted as evidence. A delayed reply, a change in tone, or a single unresolved disagreement can be pulled into a larger narrative that may not reflect reality at all. These assumptions are also deeply shaped by personal history. If someone has experienced abandonment, betrayal, inconsistency, or emotional neglect in past relationships, their mind is more likely to interpret silence as a sign of impending loss. Another person with different experiences might interpret the same silence as independence or normal space. This is why two people can experience the same situation but construct completely different meanings from it. The key issue is that assumptions feel real even when they are not accurate. The nervous system responds to imagined scenarios as if they are present realities. So once a story forms, they don't care. They are pulling away. This is ending. The emotional body begins reacting to that story. This can lead to anxiety, defensiveness, withdrawal, or attempts to regain control of the situation through communication, confrontation, or emotional escalation. Over time, if silence continues, assumptions can harden into beliefs, and beliefs are powerful because they shape behavior. The person on the receiving end of silence may begin acting as if the assumption is already true, which can unintentionally create the very outcome they feared. This is how misunderstanding grows silently, not through what is said, but through what is never clarified and repeatedly imagined. Unspoken feelings rarely remain contained within the mind. Even when a person believes they are successfully hiding what they feel, emotional energy tends to express itself through behavior, tone, timing, and relational distance. Human communication is not only verbal, it is also non-verbal and often unconscious. This means that when emotions are not directly expressed, they still find indirect pathways to surface, and those pathways are usually what the other person ends up responding to. When someone feels hurt, disappointed, or overwhelmed but does not communicate it, that emotional pressure does not simply disappear. It often begins to leak out through subtle changes. They may respond more slowly, become less warm in their tone, reduce initiations, or engage in conversations with less emotional presence. These changes can be slight, but in close relationships where people are attuned to each other, even small shifts are noticeable. The other person may not be able to name what changed, but they can sense that something has. Sometimes unspoken emotions also appear through avoidance behaviors. A person may physically or emotionally distance themselves, not out of conscious intent to punish or withdraw, but as a way of managing internal discomfort. Avoidance becomes a coping strategy, but it also communicates a message to the other person, even without words. That message is often interpreted through the lens of the receiver's own fears, which can amplify misunderstanding. In other cases, unspoken feelings can emerge as indirect expressions such as sarcasm, irritability, or sudden emotional reactions that seem disproportionate to the situation. This happens because the underlying emotion has not been processed or communicated directly, so it builds pressure internally until it finds an outlet. The outlet may not match the original cause, which is why reactions can seem confusing or out of context to the other person. The challenge is that humans rely heavily on coherence in communication. When words say one thing but behavior communicates another, the brain prioritizes behavior because it is harder to consciously control. This creates a gap between intention and perception. The person may believe they are being neutral or silent, but the relationship system is still reading signals. Over time, these unspoken emotional expressions can shape the dynamic more strongly than any explicit conversation ever would. If this is making you rethink how silence operates in your relationships, take a moment and reflect. Where are you using silence as protection? But it might be landing as confusion for someone else. If you want more breakdowns like this, where we decode emotional patterns, attachment reactions, and communication dynamics, stay with this space. There's more clarity coming your way. The idea of a soulmate often carries the expectation of emotional ease, instant understanding, and reduced conflict, but in reality, deeper emotional bonds tend to intensify communication patterns rather than eliminate them. When two people are strongly attached, the emotional system between them becomes highly responsive. This means even small shifts in attention, tone, or availability can feel amplified. Instead of reducing miscommunication, closeness actually increases the impact of miscommunication because both individuals are more emotionally invested in the outcome. In a soulmate-type connection, people often assume that connection itself should be enough to maintain harmony without needing explicit clarification. This belief can lead to unspoken expectations, where each person assumes the other will just know what they feel or need. However, even in highly compatible relationships, the mind is still shaped by personal history, attachment style, and emotional triggers. Two people can deeply care for each other and still interpret the same silence, delay, or withdrawal in completely different ways. This is where miscommunication becomes more intense. Because the emotional stakes are higher, misunderstandings are not dismissed easily. A small lack of clarity can be interpreted as a large emotional signal. For example, a delayed response might be read as disinterest, or a quiet mood might be interpreted as rejection. In less emotionally invested relationships, these same moments might be ignored or lightly brushed off. But in a deeply bonded relationship, they become meaningful data points that the mind analyzes repeatedly. The intensity of connection also increases emotional reactivity. When people feel strongly attached, their nervous systems become more sensitive to perceived threats to the bond. This can lead to overthinking, emotional withdrawal, protest behaviors, or attempts to restore closeness quickly. Ironically, the stronger the bond, the more fragile communication can become when it is not clearly maintained. The misconception is that soulmate-level connection should naturally prevent misunderstanding. In reality, it simply raises the emotional consequences of misunderstanding. Without intentional communication, emotional clarity, and reassurance, even the strongest bond can become a space where assumptions grow faster than understanding, not because the connection is weak, but because it is deeply emotionally charged. When emotional silence or distance becomes repetitive in a relationship, it can activate what is often called protest behavior, which is the nervous system's attempt to restore connection when it feels threatened. This does not always appear logical on the surface because it is not driven by rational planning but by attachment-driven alarm responses. When someone feels that emotional availability is decreasing, especially without explanation, the mind begins to seek ways to re-establish contact, even if those ways are indirect or intensified. Protest behavior can take many forms. A person might increase messaging frequency, ask repeated questions, or seek reassurance more urgently than before. Others might become more emotionally expressive, bringing up concerns more intensely in order to provoke engagement. In some cases, the response is the opposite, withdrawal in return, where the person mirrors the silence to regain a sense of control or to protect themselves from perceived rejection. These behaviors are not calculated strategies. They are emotional reflexes designed to reduce uncertainty and re-establish a felt sense of connection. What makes this response appear dramatic or out of character is the gap between intention and emotional activation. The original silence may have been intended as space, reflection, or self-regulation, but the receiving nervous system does not interpret it that way. Instead, it registers inconsistency in attachment signals. When connection feels unstable, the brain increases urgency to resolve that instability. This urgency is what drives behavior that can seem amplified or disproportionate to the initiating situation. The shocking part for many people is not that protest behavior occurs, but how quickly it escalates. A short period of emotional distance can trigger repeated attempts to reconnect, emotional outbursts, or sudden shifts in tone. These reactions are not random. They follow a predictable attachment pattern where the goal is always to reduce relational uncertainty, even if the method used is not effective in the long term. If communication remains unclear, protest behavior can cycle. One person withdraws for self-protection, the other reacts for reconnection, and both begin interpreting the other's behavior as evidence of emotional change. This loop continues until clarity is restored, or until emotional fatigue causes one or both individuals to disengage further, not because the bond is absent, but because the nervous system has reached its limit of uncertainty tolerance. Avoidance of conversation is often chosen as a way to reduce immediate emotional discomfort, but its long-term effect is usually the opposite of what is intended. When someone avoids discussing what they feel, what they need, or what they are experiencing, the relationship does not become clearer. It becomes more ambiguous. And ambiguity is the environment where misunderstandings grow most easily. Without verbal clarification, each person is left to interpret situations through their own internal filters, which are shaped by emotion, past experiences, and current insecurities. In the short term, avoiding conversation can feel calming. It creates a sense of distance from conflict, and for someone who is emotionally overwhelmed, that distance can feel like relief. However, the relief is based on temporary emotional suppression rather than resolution. The underlying issue remains unaddressed, which means it continues to exist beneath the surface of the relationship. The absence of dialogue does not neutralize the issue, it simply postpones its expression. Over time, this lack of communication creates interpretive gaps. One person may believe things are fine because nothing has been said explicitly, while the other may feel emotionally disconnected or uncertain because their internal experience has not been acknowledged. These two realities can coexist in the same relationship without either person realizing the full difference in perception. This is where misalignment begins to form quietly. Avoidance also tends to amplify emotional sensitivity. When something is not discussed, the mind naturally starts paying more attention to indirect signals such as tone, timing, or behavior. These signals then become overinterpreted because they are the only available data. A delayed response, a shorter message, or a change in energy may begin to carry more emotional weight than it normally would, simply because there is no verbal context to balance it. In relationships where avoidance becomes a pattern, communication becomes reactive instead of proactive. Conversations only happen when emotions become too intense to ignore, rather than when small misunderstandings first arise. This creates a cycle where issues accumulate silently and then surface in more emotionally charged forms. What could have been addressed simply becomes more complex over time, not because the issues are unsolvable, but because silence allowed them to grow without shared understanding. Healthy emotional connection is not maintained by intensity, chemistry, or occasional moments of understanding. It is maintained by consistency in emotional transparency. Transparency means that what is felt internally is communicated in a way that is understandable to the other person, rather than being left unspoken or expressed only through indirect behavior. When transparency is present, both individuals are able to orient themselves clearly in the relationship, even during difficult moments. When it is absent, even strong emotional bonds begin to feel uncertain. Emotional clarity reduces guesswork. Without clarity, the mind naturally begins to fill in gaps with assumptions, and those assumptions are rarely neutral. They are shaped by fear, past experiences, and emotional sensitivity. When someone does not express what they are feeling, the other person is left interpreting behavior without context. This leads to misread signals, where neutral actions may be perceived as negative or distant, simply because there is no verbal framework to explain them. Consistency is equally important because emotional safety is built through predictability over time. Predictability does not mean absence of conflict. It means that even when conflict occurs, communication patterns remain stable. People know how issues will be addressed, how emotions will be shared, and how reconnection happens after distance. Without this consistency, the nervous system remains alert, constantly trying to anticipate shifts in emotional availability. Emotional transparency also prevents buildup of unspoken tension. When feelings are regularly expressed in manageable ways, they do not accumulate into larger emotional pressure points. In contrast, when feelings are repeatedly suppressed or indirectly expressed, they tend to surface later in intensified forms, which can feel overwhelming for both individuals. This is often where sudden emotional reactions or misunderstandings appear to come out of nowhere, even though they were building silently over time. The important distinction is that emotional health in relationships is not created by never having problems, but by addressing problems as they arise with openness and clarity. Even deeply connected relationships require communication to stay aligned. Without it, even strong bonds begin to operate on interpretation rather than understanding, and interpretation is always more fragile than direct expression. In the end, silence is never just silence in a relationship. It becomes a signal, a story, and sometimes even a turning point that neither person consciously chose. What feels like protection on one side can feel like uncertainty on the other, and in that gap, emotions start to move without guidance. People do not respond to what was intended, they respond to what was felt in the absence of clarity. Every strong emotional bond still depends on something very simple: consistent communication that makes internal experiences visible. Without that, even deep connection can become confusing, and even care can start to look like distance. The nervous system is always trying to make sense of relational changes, and when it does not receive clear answers, it creates its own. This is why misunderstandings rarely begin with conflict. They begin with what was not said, what was assumed, and what was left to interpretation for too long. Over time, those small gaps can grow into emotional distance that feels sudden, even though it was gradual. A healthy connection is not defined by the absence of silence, but by the ability to explain it, repair it, and return from it with understanding. When both people are willing to bring clarity into uncomfortable moments, silence loses its power to distort meaning. It becomes space instead of confusion, reflection instead of fear. In the end, relationships do not break because people feel too little. They struggle when what is felt is not translated into words that can be understood. And when clarity returns, so does connection.